Listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
Chris Hedges writes in SheerPost, the collapse of U.S. media is accelerating our political crisis. A third of all U.S. newspapers have permanently closed. The industry is hemorrhaging reporters, and private equity and big tech are to blame. For insight into this, we turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moore's Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest books are entitled I Dare Say, a Gerald Horne Reader and Acknowledging Radical Histories. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So the piece continues. Yet another wave of media layoffs is putting hundreds of journalists out of work across some of the largest major news outlets in the U.S., including CNN, the LA Times, Vox, CNBC, Gannett, and others. Dr. Horne, it seems that if journalism were true journalism, they would be ramping up reporters as there is so much news to be covered as the empire is on the wane and struggle and crisis continues to explode.
That is a fair point, but what the news media is enmeshed in is something that we're all too familiar with, and I'm speaking of a general crisis of the entire capitalist system. That is to say, the news media has found it difficult to absorb the meaning of the internet. For newspapers, that basically altered radically its distribution model from print dead trees to the electronic medium, and that also helped to devastate its revenues in terms of advertising in light of the fact that Facebook and Google have soaked up advertising dollars to the detriment of the Los Angeles Times and the Washington Post. And then there is artificial intelligence, which has already begun to assert itself. Already you have the specter and spectacle of AI writing sports stories, writing accounts of city council meetings, etc. And by the way, AI is not only coming for the job of journalists, it is also coming for the job of lawyers who write contracts, or artificial intelligence can do that much more easily and cheaply, not to mention those who write computer code. And so we also see that the news media, and this is really the nub of the question and goes to the heart of your opening statement, it has not been able to adapt to radically changing political realities. And we see that as a case study in the recent death of Navalny, the so-called Russian dissident. You have to dig deeply in the U.S. press to find out that an essential part of his biography and obituary has been Islamophobia. That led to a controversy within Amnesty International, which tried to revoke his exalted status as prisoner of conscience because of his hate speech. And that is just a symbol of the failings of the media because we want to get an account of what happened when we pick up a newspaper or tune in to CNN, but instead we oftentimes just get the current line of the neocons or the neoliberals. Speaking of CNN, it's no guarantee that it will be around by the end of the decade. You can say the same thing for National Public Radio. And of course, you mentioned the Los Angeles Times in your opening remarks, which has been laying off journalists left and right. And it's probably going to be up for sale to the latest billionaire or equity capital firm that wants to take a flyer at it. This also has contributed within the news media to the weakness of unions. The unions are particularly weak in the weakening sector of print media. This has been assisted, I'm afraid to say, by the management of newspapers. Recall that it was not so long ago that your own Washington Post was involved in the breaking of unions, from which they have yet to recover. And so, all in all, this crisis that we see in the news media that Christopher Hedges has pointed out is not only a crisis of the news media, as stated, it's a crisis of the entire capitalist system. However, that also suggests why we should pay careful and close attention to it, because with regard to the inevitable demise of capitalism, it's apparent that the news media will get there first.
And you know, I mean, I also I think too, like me, I don't watch that stuff anymore. I watch YouTube all the time, and I watch all these YouTube shows. I was over at a friend of mine's house recently, and his son, who's like in his early 30s, was from out of town. He hasn't been there. I haven't seen him in a long time, and we were talking to him about different things. And he related to me, "Oh yeah, I just watch these YouTube or Rumble or whatever shows." I think a part of it is, and when I asked him, "Well, do you watch any mainstream media?" He was like, "I don't watch that crap. It's just a bunch of lies." They have so discredited themselves. There is such a crisis of legitimacy in so many of the traditional institutions, the media being just one of them, that people are turning away. And you can't sell advertisement if there's nobody to watch the advertisement.
Well, let me give you one quick example today. I'm coming in, I'm listening to NPR. They're interviewing a Ukrainian who has written a book about the first year of the conflict. He says, we go back to 2014, and I'm waiting for him to talk about the coup. He says, that's when Russia went into the Donbass, took Crimea, blah, 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 blah. Never mentioned the coup. And as soon as I heard that, I turned it off. I said, well, this is garbage.
Dr. Horne.
Garbage indeed. And I think that when the history of this period is written, speaking of the Ukraine, I think that an astute historian would point out that the Ukraine crisis helped to trigger or helped to accelerate the continuing decline of the news media. That is to say, it was apparent early on that we were being fed a line by the mainstream press. They were trying to massage our consciousness, trying to direct us into a particular category. And I think that led to what Garland has just referred to. That is to say, we get our media now a la carte. We'll tune into Al Jazeera, for example, with regard to what's going on in historic Palestine. We'll tune into Sputnik, for example, for many other items as well. And speaking of historic Palestine, I think that the crisis of the media was also accelerated on October 7, 2023, because it's no secret that the Zionist lobby has a stranglehold over a good deal of the U.S. media, not least the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, CBS News, NBC News, NPR, et cetera. And given the fact that the international community, particularly the global South, the global majority, was not necessarily being referenced in those aforementioned organs, that accelerated the exodus from the mainstream media, contributing to their general crisis, contributing to their inexorable decline.
Consortium News has a piece throwing good money after bad in Ukraine. Ray McGovern and Lawrence Wilkerson argue the U.S. should accept that no amount of U.S. funding will change Russia's will and means to prevail in Ukraine. And I think this ties directly to what we were just talking about, because one of the reasons why a lot of citizens in the U.S. Can't get to that point or that headspace is because of the lies that they're being fed through the Western media.
Oh, indeed. And with regard to that particular crisis, it's apparent that the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is collapsing. Clearly, this organization, speaking of NATO, which came into existence in 1949 in order to destabilize the Soviet Union and the socialist camp, it should have disappeared in 1989 with the collapse of the Berlin Wall, or in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. But alas, what we discovered was that NATO was not just anti-Soviet, it was anti-Russian. That is to say, it was also designed to make sure that the vast resources of Russia, gold, diamonds, natural gas, oil, would be under the control of the North Atlantic countries so that they could be in an advantageous position to go after the big enchilada, which is the People's Republic of China. And so with the unmasking of NATO and with a major political party in the United States, speaking of the Republicans, expressing doubt and distaste for its future existence, that too is contributing to the general crisis of the news media, because it's no secret that the New York Times, the Washington Post, et cetera, are all on board with regard to the continuation of NATO. And there are increasing numbers of U.S. nationals who are not on board and therefore are rejecting what they're being fed by the U.S. media in that regard. You see a similar crisis unfolding in Europe, where the party of Chancellor Scholz is on the ropes because he has led his country into an abyss insofar as he's gone along with the Ukraine caper and misadventure. His prospects for electoral success going forward are slim and none. You could say the same thing for Macron and France. You could say the same thing, in fact, for London and Rishi Sunak, and pay attention to these headlines in the British press that suggest that Boris Johnson, of all people, the former prime minister, might become the future candidate for that exalted post in London. And of course, speaking of NATO, you already see that Turkey, or Turkey, which is touted as the eastern flank of NATO, actually has one foot out of the door, although it has apparently capitulated to the idea that both Sweden and Finland should be part of NATO. And even though it has supplied drones to Ukraine, it's no secret that in order to beef up its relationship with Moscow, it has allowed Turkey to become a major transit point for commodities going into Russia, circumventing North Atlantic sanctions. And there is a further deepening crisis in NATO that your audience should pay attention to. I'm speaking to the fact that Poland is spending money hand over fist for its military. Obviously, or apparently, this military will be aimed not necessarily at some of its neighbors, other than, for example, Ukraine and perhaps Germany. So what's happening is that NATO has outlived its existence. The European Union, which has gone along with the U.S. line, has overplayed its hand. And speaking of which, I should also make the further point, that is to say that the United States, in a sense, was the original European Union. It helped to absorb many migrants from every corner of that continent, and under the umbrella of whiteness or white supremacy. But obviously, that particular approach is under stress and strain because of the rise of China. So there might have to be some sort of consolidation between the original European Union, speaking of the United States, and its moth-eaten successor, speaking of the Brussels-based European Union. All in all, it's not a good look or a good prognosis for the North Atlantic countries.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.
Thank you.